A ragged beggar walked into a wealthy church, and everyone judged him. But 30 minutes later, when he walked to the pulpit and revealed who he really was, the entire congregation froze in shock. Sunday mornings in Brookfield always looked the same. Sunlight spilled gently across manicured lawns. Luxury cars rolled quietly into the parking lot, one after another: sleek black SUVs, polished sedans, vehicles that reflected the kind of quiet wealth people rarely talked about. But everyone noticed. Families stepped out dressed in their best, tailored suits, elegant dresses, children with neatly combed hair holding their parents' hands as they walked toward the towering wooden doors of Brookfield Community Church. Laughter floated in the air. Friendly greetings. Firm handshakes. "Good morning, brother. Blessed Sunday. It's going to be a wonderful service today." Everything about the scene felt polished, predictable, comfortable. A man appeared at the edge of the parking lot. At first, no one noticed him. He stood still for a moment, studying the church building like someone trying to decide if he truly belonged there. His clothes were worn and wrinkled. His coat looked several winters old. His shoes were cracked at the sides, the soles nearly separating. A rough beard covered his face, and a small canvas bag hung from his shoulder. Slowly, carefully, he began walking toward the entrance. One woman noticed first. Her smile faded slightly. Then a man beside her followed her gaze. The whispers started almost instantly. "Who is that? Is he homeless? I've never seen him before." The man continued forward, his eyes calm, his pace steady, but the energy around him began to shift. People stepped subtly to the side as he passed. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Some stared openly, others avoided looking at him altogether. Near the entrance stood a church usher named Martin, a tall man in a crisp blue blazer with a warm, practiced smile that usually welcomed every visitor, but when he saw the approaching stranger, the smile stiffened. Martin stepped forward just before the man reached the doors. "Good morning," he said politely, though his voice carried a cautious edge. "Can I help you?" The stranger nodded gently. "I was hoping to attend the service." Martin hesitated. His eyes quickly scanned the man from head to toe. The torn shoes, the worn coat with a weathered bag. Behind them, more church members had begun gathering near the entrance, watching quietly. Well, Martin said carefully, lowering his voice, "We usually ask visitors like yourself to speak with our outreach office during the week if you need assistance." The man tilted his head slightly. "I'm not here for assistance," he said softly. "I'm here for worship." That answer made a few people nearby exchange looks. A woman in an expensive pearl necklace leaned toward her friend and whispered, loud enough to be heard, "This is really not appropriate." Another man folded his arms. "This church isn't a shelter." Then an older church elder named Richard stepped closer, his expression firm and impatient. "Listen," Richard muttered under his breath, though his tone carried enough sharpness for others to hear. "We donate plenty to charity programs, but Sunday service isn't the place for this." The stranger simply listened. No anger, no defense, just quiet patience for a moment. The tension hung thick in the air. Then the man nodded respectfully. "Thank you," he said, and without another word he stepped around them, opened the heavy wooden door, and walked inside. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Some frowned. Others shook their heads in quiet disapproval. But no one stopped him again. Inside the sanctuary, the man walked slowly down the aisle, past rows of polished wooden pews and stained glass windows, glowing in the morning light. Nearly every seat was filled with well-dressed worshippers chatting comfortably. A few noticed him immediately. Whispers followed his every step. He reached the very last pew in the back and sat down quietly. From there, he could see everything. Congregation, the people who had welcomed him, and the many who had not. No one inside that church realized something important. The man they had just judged, the man they had nearly turned away, was the new pastor they were all waiting to meet. And what the congregation would reveal about themselves over the next 30 minutes would expose more about their faith than any sermon ever could. The sanctuary slowly filled with music as the service began. Soft piano notes floated through the room while people settled into their seats, adjusting jackets, smoothing dresses, greeting the friends they saw every Sunday. But every few seconds, another head turned. Another pair of eyes glanced toward the back pew, toward the man in worn clothes sitting quietly by himself. He didn't move much. His posture was calm, his hands resting loosely on the small bag beside him, yet his presence seemed louder than the music. Two women in the middle row leaned close to each other. "Do you see him?" One whispered, "Yes." The other murmured, "I don't understand how he got inside." Now across the aisle a man shifted uncomfortably and nudged his wife. "Maybe someone should talk to the ushers," he muttered. More people noticed now. Some glanced quickly and looked away. Others stared longer, their expressions tight with quiet judgment. A couple entering late walked halfway down the aisle before spotting him. The husband slowed. "Let's sit somewhere else," he whispered, guiding his wife into a different row, seat by seat. Space. opened around the back pew like an invisible wall had formed. Around him, the man noticed. Of course he noticed, but he said nothing. His eyes simply moved across the room, studying faces, observing reactions, the way a careful listener hears words others miss. Near the front, one woman didn't bother whispering, dressed in a tailored white suit with gold jewelry catching the light. She leaned toward an usher standing nearby. Her voice carried farther than she intended. "This is exactly why churches have to maintain standards," she said firmly. "People can't just wander in off the street." The usher nodded awkwardly, glancing back toward the man in the last row. A moment later, another member approached him with the same concern. "There's a homeless man sitting in the sanctuary," he whispered urgently. "Right back there." The usher forced a polite smile. "I'll keep an eye on it." But the murmurs didn't stop. They multiplied. Meanwhile, the man in the back pew quietly reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook. He opened it carefully and began writing short lines, simple notes. Who ignored him, who stared with her open discomfort, who pretended not to notice at all. But he also noticed something else in the third row from the back. An elderly woman turned slowly in her seat and studied him for a moment. Her expression wasn't disgusted, just thoughtful. She stood up carefully, walking down the aisle with the slow patience of someone who had lived long enough not to rush. When she reached him, she offered a gentle smile. "Would you like to sit closer to the front?" she asked kindly. "There's plenty of space up there." The man smiled back, grateful. "Thank you," he said softly, "but I'm comfortable here." The woman nodded, as if understanding something deeper than his words. "All right," she said warmly. "Just thought I'd ask." She returned to her seat, a few rows ahead. A young boy twisted around in the pew, staring curiously at the stranger. Their eyes met. The boy gave a small wave. The man lifted his hand and waved back. The boy grinned. But, around them, the tension in the room continued to grow. Not long after, a tall church leader quietly approached the back pew. His smile was polite, but his voice carried quiet authority. "Sir," he said softly, leaning closer so others wouldn't hear, "we're glad you came today, but after the service, we may need to talk about finding you some assistance through our outreach program." The man nodded calmly. "I understand." The leader hesitated, then added carefully, "And depending on the situation, it may be best if you exit the building after the service concludes." Another nod. Still no argument. Still no anger. The leader walked away, relieved the interaction had been quiet. Moments later, the congregation rose together as the worship team began the first song. Voices filled the sanctuary. Hands lifted. Lyrics echoed through the room about love, grace, and welcoming the stranger. The man in the back pew listened quietly as the voices around him sang words about compassion, words about humility, words about seeing the divine in every person. Yet every few moments, another glance drifted toward him. Another whisper passed between neighbors. Another silent judgment formed. The man lowered his eyes to his notebook again. He wrote more names, wrote more moments, or truths. Then he closed the notebook slowly and looked toward the stage as the music faded. The church chairman stepped forward to make the morning announcements. His smile was bright, his voice full of excitement. "Before we continue today," he said proudly, "I have wonderful news to share." The congregation leaned forward. "As many of you know, today is a very special Sunday, because this morning, our new pastor will be arriving to join us." A ripple of excitement swept through the room. People straightened in their seats. Whispers changed tone instantly. "I heard he's incredible. They say he's a powerful speaker. I can't wait to meet him." Everyone began looking toward the front doors, expecting someone impressive, someone confident, someone polished, but none of them realized something remarkable. The man they were waiting for was already sitting quietly among them, watching, learning, testing, and when the moment finally came for the new pastor to step forward, no one in that church was ready for what they were about to see. The service moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened. The worship team finished their final song, and the sanctuary settled into a quiet anticipation as a visiting preacher stepped up to the pulpit. He was a well-known speaker, confident, and charismatic, his voice filling the room with practiced warmth. "Good morning, church," he began. "Good morning," the congregation replied. He smiled broadly and opened his Bible. "Today," he said, "I want to speak about something simple, but something powerful. Kindness." Heads nodded immediately. "True faith," the preacher continued, "is revealed in how we treat the stranger, how we welcome those who feel unseen. Because sometimes the people we overlook are the very people God sends to test our hearts." "Amen," someone called out. Several others echoed the word. The message unfolded beautifully. The preacher spoke about compassion, humility, loving your neighbor, opening your doors to those in need. His words were polished and inspiring, each sentence delivered with perfect rhythm. Around the sanctuary, people nodded with approval. Some lifted their hands in agreement. Others murmured soft amens under their breath. But in the very last pew, the man in worn clothes continued watching quietly, His eyes moved across the room, noticing every reaction, every whisper, every subtle shift in body language. Near the front, a group of well-dressed men leaned toward each other, speaking in low voices. "They really need to tighten security around here," one of them muttered. The man beside him nodded. "Exactly. If one homeless guy can just walk in, what stops 10 more? A third man sighed. "This church has a reputation to protect." They straightened in their seats just as the preacher raised his voice for emphasis. Meanwhile, 2 rows ahead of the back pew, a teenage girl turned slightly in her seat. She glanced behind her, her eyes landing on the quiet stranger. A small grin spread across her face. She pulled out her phone, angled it carefully, and snapped a quick photo. Then she turned back to her friend, whispering through a quiet giggle. "Look at this," she said, showing the picture. Her friend stifled a laugh. Further down the aisle, a man wrinkled his nose as he passed the back row on his way to an empty seat. "Does anyone else smell that?" he whispered to his wife. She frowned slightly. "Let's just move forward." All around the sanctuary, beautiful words about love continued pouring from the pulpit, but the quiet contradictions in the room were impossible to miss. Still, not everyone turned away. The elderly woman who had spoken to the man earlier slowly approached again, carrying a small bottle of water. She offered it gently. "You might be thirsty," she said kindly. The man accepted it with gratitude. "Thank you." A few minutes later, the young boy from earlier twisted around again in his seat. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice filled with innocent concern. The man nodded with a small smile. "I'm doing just fine." The boy seemed satisfied with that answer. Not long after, a quiet middle-aged man wearing a simple gray suit walked past the back pew, paused for a moment, then turned back. He extended his hand. "Good to have you here," he said sincerely. The stranger shook his hand firmly. "Thank you." Small moments, simple gestures, but they stood out sharply against the growing discomfort in the room once again. The man opened his notebook. More notes appeared on the page. More observations, more truths. The sermon continued for another 20 minutes before finally ending with applause and a final prayer. People began shifting in their seats. As the service moved toward its closing announcements at that moment, several members who had arrived late began quietly entering the sanctuary from the side doors. One of them noticed the man in the back immediately. "Did he wander in?" the newcomer whispered. Another shrugged. "Probably asking for money." A church deacon standing near the aisle overheard the conversation. He walked slowly toward the back pew, stopping beside the stranger. His voice was polite, but uneasy. "Sir," the deacon said quietly, "we're about to introduce our new pastor in a few minutes. After that, it might be best if you head out. We don't want any confusion." The man looked up at him calmly. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet curiosity. He nodded once. "I understand." Then, after a brief pause, he asked a simple question. "May I ask you something?" The deacon hesitated. "Of course." The man folded his hands gently. "Do you think Jesus would be welcome here today if he came dressed like me?" The question hung in the air like a sudden storm cloud. The deacon blinked, clearly caught off guard. "That's not exactly," but the words never fully formed, because at that exact moment, the church chairman stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. The room fell silent. "Before we close today," the chairman announced proudly, "we have a very special moment." Excited whispers spread instantly across the sanctuary. "As you all know," he continued with a broad smile, "today we finally welcome the new spiritual leader of Brookfield Community Church." Applause broke out. People straightened in their seats, eagerly turning toward the stage. "We are honored to introduce the man who will guide this congregation into the future," the chairman said. The sanctuary buzzed with anticipation. But in the last pew, the quiet man slowly closed his notebook, and for the first time all morning, he stood up, because the man they had judged, the man they had whispered about, the man they had nearly removed from the church, was about to walk onto that stage. The church chairman stood proudly at the center of the stage, adjusting the microphone as the final applause faded. His smile stretched wide across his face, the kind of smile that carried excitement and ceremony. "Today," he said warmly, "is a very special day for our church." The congregation leaned forward in their seats. "For months," he continued, "our board has prayed, searched, and waited for the right leader to guide this congregation into the future." More nods filled the room, "and I'm happy to tell you," the chairman said proudly, "that our new pastor has already arrived." A ripple of excitement moved through the sanctuary. People began turning their heads immediately, scanning the room for someone impressive, someone polished, someone who looked like the kind of leader a church like this would proudly present. The chairman continued. "In fact," he added with a grin, "our new pastor has been here the entire morning." Whispers spread quickly. "Who is it? Where is he? Is he in the front row?" Dozens of people looked toward the doors. Others searched the first few rows where respected guests usually sat, but no one looked toward the back. Not at first. Then, a chair shifted quietly. At the very last pew of the sanctuary, the man in the worn coat slowly stood up. At first, no one reacted. A few people noticed and frowned. assuming he was simply preparing to leave. One woman near the aisle whispered with mild irritation, "Now is not the time." A couple of people even chuckled nervously, confused. Someone murmured, but the man didn't turn toward the exit. Instead, he stepped into the aisle and began walking forward step by step, row by row, toward the stage. The whispers grew louder. "Where is he going? Someone stop him. Is he serious right now?" A few church leaders exchanged uneasy glances. The chairman's smile began to fade slightly, but the man kept walking, calm, steady, unhurried. Every pair of eyes in the sanctuary followed him now. A teenager who had taken his photo earlier slowly lowered her phone. The wealthy elder who had complained near the entrance stared with growing confusion. The deacon near the aisle shifted uncomfortably, and in the third row from the back, the elderly woman watched with quiet curiosity. The man reached the steps leading up to the stage. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. Then he climbed the steps. The chairman stepped slightly aside, his expression now a mixture of uncertainty and realization. The man walked calmly to the center of the stage. He placed his worn bag gently on the floor. Then he slipped off his old coat. The fabric fell away, revealing a simple but clean shirt underneath. Next, he removed a pair of glasses from his pocket and wiped them carefully with a cloth. The small, ordinary gesture somehow made the silence in the room feel even heavier. Finally, he stepped toward the microphone. For several seconds, he simply looked out at the congregation, at the faces that had stared, whispered, judged, avoided, and a few who had shown kindness. Then he spoke my name. He said calmly, "Es Pastor Daniel." The words landed like thunder. A wave of shock swept across the room. Eyes widened. Hands slowly covered mouths. The wealthy elder near the front leaned forward as if he had misheard. The teenager who had laughed earlier went pale. The deacon near the aisle froze completely. Pastor Daniel allowed the silence to linger before continuing. "This morning," he said gently, "I arrived early." His eyes moved slowly across the sanctuary. "I didn't come dressed like a pastor." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. "I came dressed like a stranger." The room remained painfully still. I wanted to see this church the same way. Someone new might experience it. His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight, so I said, "Among you." He paused and I watched. No one moved. I watched who welcomed me. His eyes drifted briefly toward the elderly woman. I watched who avoided me. Several heads slowly lowered. I listened to the whispers. The wealthy donors in the front rows shifted in their seats. I heard the concerns about standards. The woman in the white suit stared down at her hands. I heard the suggestions that security should keep people like me outside. The silence deepened. Then Pastor Daniel smiled softly. But I also saw something else. His eyes turned toward the third row, a kind woman who offered me a better seat. Tears filled the elderly woman's eyes instantly, and a young boy who waved at me like I belonged here. The boy sat up straighter, pride shining across his face, and a man who shook my hand without asking any questions. The middle-aged man in the gray suit looked stunned. Pastor Daniel bent down slowly and picked up the small notebook from his bag. He held it gently in one hand. "Inside this notebook," he said quietly, "are the moments I witnessed this morning." The room felt smaller now. More honestly, I didn't write these things down to shame anyone. He paused again. "I wrote them down because sometimes the most honest sermon is the one we preach with our actions." He closed the notebook slowly. Then he looked out across the silent congregation and said softly, "Today, before I ever stepped onto this stage, the church preached a sermon to me." No one spoke, no one moved, because in that moment, the person in the sanctuary realized they had just been seen, and the final words Pastor Daniel spoke that morning would leave the entire congregation in tears. *AC B Resolution AFT RAFT AAFT AFAAX AAX AX 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 AAX AAX AAAAAAAAAA. No one expected. The sanctuary remained completely silent. Not the peaceful silence that sometimes follows a prayer. This was different. Heavy, honest. The kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone suddenly realizes something uncomfortable about themselves. Pastor Daniel stood behind the pulpit, his hands resting lightly on the small notebook. He looked across the congregation again, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the quiet patience of someone who had already decided to tell the truth. "I didn't come here this morning with a prepared sermon," he said softly. His voice echoed gently through the sanctuary. "But after everything I witnessed today, I realized God already gave us one." No one interrupted, no one shifted in their seats. "Faith," Pastor Daniel continued, "is a beautiful word." He gestured. "Around the church it fills buildings like this. It fills songs. It fills prayers. His eyes moved slowly across the rows of polished pews. But faith isn't measured by the size of a church building. A few heads lowered. It's not measured by the price of our clothes. More eyes dropped toward the floor, and it's not measured by how loudly we sing on Sunday mornings. He paused. Faith is measured by something much simpler. His voice softened even more. It's measured by how we treat the person no one else notices. The words settled over the congregation like a mirror being quietly lifted in front of them. Pastor Daniel opened the Bible resting on the pulpit. Scripture tells us again and again, he said gently, to welcome the stranger. He turned a page, to feed the hungry. Another page, to show mercy. The sanctuary remained still as he read the words slowly, allowing them to sink deeper than any sermon many of them had heard before. Then Pastor Daniel closed the Bible and looked directly at the congregation. I want to ask you something, he said. His voice carried no accusation, only honesty. If Jesus walked into this church today, he paused, letting the words breathe, dressed like a homeless man. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Would we recognize him? The question landed harder than anything else he had said. Across the sanctuary, heads slowly bowed. Some people closed their eyes. Others stared quietly at their hands. From somewhere in the middle rows, the soft sound of someone crying broke the silence. Then another, near the front of the church. The wealthy elder who had spoken harshly near the entrance earlier slowly rose to his feet. The movement drew quiet attention. His voice was unsteady. I need to say something. He cleared his throat. This morning, he said quietly, I was one of the first people to judge you. He looked toward Pastor Daniel with visible regret. I'm ashamed of that. The room remained silent. I forgot something important today, the elder continued. I forgot that every person who walks through those doors deserves dignity. His voice cracked slightly. I'm sorry. He sat down again slowly. But something had changed. Moments later, another person stood, then another. Quiet apologies began rising from different parts of the sanctuary. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. The kind of honesty that only appears when pride finally steps aside. Pastor Daniel listened patiently to each voice. Then he lifted his hand gently, calming the room. There's something else I want to say, he added. His eyes moved toward the elderly woman sitting quietly with tears in her eyes this morning. One person stood up and offered kindness when it would have been easier to walk away. The congregation turned toward her. Applause began softly. Then it spread across the room. The woman covered her mouth, overwhelmed by the attention. Pastor Daniel smiled warmly. And a young man back there, he continued, nodding toward the boy, who had waved earlier, reminded all of us that compassion sometimes comes from the smallest hearts. The boy's face lit up instantly as the congregation applauded again. Pastor Daniel let the moment settle before speaking one final time. The church, he said slowly, is not this building. His voice carried across every corner of the sanctuary. It's not the wall, it's not the stage, it's not the lights. He looked across the room one last time. The church is the heart we show to every person who walks through its doors. The silence that followed felt different, now lighter, humbled, transformed later that week. Someone who had been sitting near the front uploaded a video of the moment online. Within hours, it began spreading. Thousands watched it, then hundreds of thousands. Soon, millions of people were sharing the story. Comment sections filled with reflection. With emotion, with the same question Pastor Daniel had asked that morning. But inside Brookfield Community Church, the moment meant something even deeper, because that congregation would never forget. The Sunday when their new pastor arrived dressed as a beggar, and the lesson they learned that day would echo far beyond those walls. Because sometimes, the greatest test of faith is how we treat the person we believe has nothing to offer us.